I want to turn now to the concept of total pain, which is one of the probably the most important underlying theoretical underpinning of hospice and palliative care in the contemporary era. And it emerges from actual practice, and so it's often been said that through the many hours that Cicely Saunders spent as a nurse, as a doctor, as a social worker on the wards, talking to people, recording their histories, recording their stories, listening to their stories, this concept develops. And of course, it's also influenced by her religious beliefs. And so we need to understand this concept. It is the topic of your second assignment, and it's very important to understanding what makes hospice and palliative care different than other approaches to biomedicine. And I think it's also important to note, and Joe Wood talks about this, the idea that this can become, the way it's taken a lot of the time, it just gets subsumed in the medical model and it becomes a kind of checklist, and that is not at all what was meant by it. And so I think we have to really dig down into what the original understanding of total pain was. So I'm including here a quote from David Clark in his book, To Comfort Always. And as I mentioned in the earlier lecture, Clark is probably the leading expert on Dame Cicely Saunders. He knew her personally, and I was told on good authority that she often would invite him into her office, and she had a little store of whiskey, and they would have a glass of whiskey together. So again, this importance of personal relationships just running throughout the whole life of Cicely Saunders, but also the development of hospice. And so Clark, I find him interesting. I haven't met him, but I've spoken to him on Zoom, and my impression of him was he's a very typical English, probably atheist, definitely agnostic, and so some of the more religious aspects of Cicely Saunders, I think, can cause him some discomfort, but he's very honest about that, and he tries to give it its proper place. But I do think if the person approaching her has particularly negative attitudes to religion, it can become very difficult to understand what's motivating her. But there is no doubt that David Clark is totally devoted to her and to her work. And as I told you, he played an instrumental role in developing the archive at King's College and taking her work seriously and getting it out there. And he's given numberless lectures around the world. Also, when I last spoke to him, he was developing a play. He's retired now, so he's developing a play about the meeting between Cicely Saunders and David Tasma, and I would love to bring that to Canada and to see that in Canada. So I want to look at this here. So he says, if Twycross demolished the prevailing method of relieving pain, Saunders created a radically new approach to conceptualizing it. So he's referring to Twycross, who worked with developing pain medication. And so there's a long history, I don't need to go into it, of the Brompton cocktail, which is truly stunning combination of things. It's let me think now, heroin, cocaine, and alcohol, and then I think there's something else in there too. So this was being used, and I'm sure it did, it would obliterate consciousness, actually. And so we see through the work of people like, he wasn't the only one working on this, of course, of Twycross, that they realized very quickly that the only really important part of that cocktail was the heroin or the morphine, that you didn't need all the other drugs. And so he revolutionizes this. And also the idea of treating pain consistently throughout the day rather than waiting for it to break through. This is another very important aspect of how these thinkers in palliative care and hospice work together. So you see that within palliative care now, that idea that the person is constantly being treated for pain so that they don't get into a situation where it's so overwhelming. So there were doctors working on that, on the actual science and practice of pain relief, and they did an amazing job. And from what I can understand anyway, that is less of a concern. In most cases, pain can be dealt with now. But as he says here, Saunders created a radically new approach to conceptualizing pain. And this is where we get into nuance, and this is I'm afraid that nuance almost always gets thrown out. Maybe that was always true, but it is certainly true in our time period, which wants bullet points for everything. When I'm teaching, I can often feel the desire for bullet points, and I don't very rarely use them because they strip away the nuance. That being said, my next slide has bullet points, but it's pretty rare for me. So this idea that she was radically reconceptualizing pain. Now, I talk about this a lot in health and healing as well, that we often have these ideas that we think are simple and straightforward. So I often talk about the idea of the body, that we think that's simple and straightforward, when in fact it's culturally constructed, our ideas about our body. And it's the same with pain. And I think that, the sort of on the street understanding of pain is just, I hit my thumb with a hammer and it hurts me. That's what pain is. And I think this has really caused a problem in debates around assisted dying versus palliative care, that is sort of the discourse of MAID is all about pain, 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 without an understanding that really in most cases we've been able to deal with that. And I have raised this point before, that I sometimes wonder if people are talking about their own pain more than the pain of the person. And so that takes us into a whole other realm, which I'll be discussing in this lecture. And so, so Saunders is radically reconceptualizing pain to mean much, much more. She obviously is including physical pain in this, but the idea that it's a much larger concept, and also that it's culturally construed. And I knew somebody that worked in nursing, and she told me that cultures react very differently to pain. And so as a nurse, she would know what to expect, often depending on the culture, that some cultures are very stoic and they don't scream or cry, and some are very expressive. And so, and that part of that expressiveness is to get response from family and so on. And so just this idea that pain is not, big takeaway here, pain is not just this simple issue of, I have a pain in my body. So he goes on to say, a striking feature of Saunders' early work was its articulation of the relationship between physical and mental suffering. This reached full expression with the concept of total pain, which was taken to include physical symptoms, mental distress, social problems, and emotional difficulties. So he's getting at part of it here. He's emphasizing the mental suffering, which obviously can be very important when people are dealing with end of life, but her model upholds a number of dimensions that I think he's not emphasizing as much. So I do want to turn to that now. Dame Cicely Saunders was the first to say that she was not an academic in that sense of creating theories and writing about them. She was a very hands-on person who, as you could see, had a very full life of treating patients and building the first contemporary hospice. So as I said, it's been later writers who have tried to tease out what exactly is meant by this. And so certainly she is clear that she has a different concept of personhood. So if we look at the biomedical model, it is typically understanding a person as a kind of a machine. And so you're attending to problems with the machine that has gone wrong. Obviously, that's not true of all people working in healthcare, but that is the biomedical model. It's materialist, it's physicalist. It just comes down to the body is not functioning properly. And of course, that's part of it. But Saunders, with a religious philosophical outlook on life, sees the human person as much more than that. So it's the body, the sort of the physicality of the body, but it's that human personhood has all these dimensions. And this is true of certainly of all the religious and spiritual traditions that I know of, that they all understand the human person in this much broader sense with these many dimensions to the person. So the physical is just one. So clearly in hospice and palliative care, dealing with physical pain is number one that they're seeking to address. And so there's many, many ways of doing this. As I talked about, use of medication and opiates is one of them, and probably the main one if we're talking about conditions like cancer that can be very painful. Not all deaths are painful in that sense, but if they are, that is one of the primary interventions. There can also be the prescribing of anti-anxiety medications. Also, I know from the the local hospice, they have installed this a bath, so people can have a bath. Also, you know, just caring for the body in those basic ways of making sure there's no bed sores and so on, and adjusting them so that they're more comfortable and so on. So certainly the hospice and palliative care in Canada handles this beautifully. People get extremely good training in attending to physical pain. I think it's in these other domains where things may start to be less. I'd be interested to hear on the discussion boards people's opinions about this. So, okay, the physical, the emotional. So, especially when we're talking with any illness, but particularly end of life, we're looking at the need to address people's emotional pain, and so, or their mental or emotional self. And I think that this we're perhaps often less comfortable with. And I think this is where this theory has so much to offer medicine in general, not just palliative hospice care. The idea that we need to be coming to this as that we're dealing with a whole person. So their emotions are on board. And I know that it can seem like people are sometimes acting irrationally, but they're acting like human beings, which is we have emotions and we don't always follow things logically. And so certainly at end of life, people are often struggling with a variety of issues, and often, particularly the nurses who are around the most or the volunteers, are often need to be able to listen and be sympathetic to these issues rather than simply shutting them down. And I think this is where new forms of training can be very, very important. This idea that not being uncomfortable if somebody's expressing emotional pain, or simply trying to medicate when that's not really what's going on. So the other one is social, and I think this is important, and hospices do typically talk about this, the idea of bereavement, that the idea that this end of life is impacting not just the person who's dying, but also their friends, their family, their community. And so in this sense that death is social, I don't think we think of it that way. We think of it very individually. We're a very individualistic culture in Canada overall. And so I think this is changing. I was talking in my health and healing class about the way that increasingly families and friends are actually encouraged to stay overnight with people, and there's actually chairs or beds that they can access so that they can do that. So I think that biomedicine is, and I think it's been influenced by hospice care actually, the idea that the friends, the family, the community can become support around both the healthcare practitioners and the person who's dying. And so this idea that human beings are social, and so of course they're going to die in that way in relationship to other people. And when we look at case histories of end of life that Cicely Saunders herself writes, the emotional and the social are often together. So just something like, if it's a case of somebody who's dying young, say they have young children, this is going to be top of their mind. It may not be their physical pain that's top of their mind. It may be their concern about the well-being of their children and what's going to happen to them after their death. And so this brings on board the idea of the social, so perhaps the family moving in to reassure the person that those children will be taken care of, and so on. And so this idea, I think, is very important. And we can see Cicely Saunders really took from the nursing orders that she worked with, the Catholic nursing orders. And so she gives an example of one man who was, up until the last days, he was relatively healthy. And so he was able to still go to the pub and hang out with people and have a drink. And so this idea that people remain themselves, they remain fully human in all their needs right up into the end of life, and that includes their social needs, is a very important part of this model. And then the fourth, spiritual, and I find this is the one that gets shunted aside, as I was saying in the other lecture. And I think this just speaks to, in Canada, it's complex because you have the secularism. There's a growing minority of people that have no religious or spiritual beliefs, so there's that aspect. There's multiculturalism, which is that people come from a variety of different religious and spiritual traditions in Canada. And so the spiritual, I think because it's complicated, there's a tendency I've seen to just say, let's just jettison that. And I think that's a problem. And so I would include philosophical here. So the idea that at end of life, people are often grappling with meaning, the meaning of their life, and how they live their life, and so on. And this then reads back into the social. So it's very typical, some of you may have experienced this, where a person who's perhaps they had a falling out with a family member or a friend years before wants to meet up with them, wants to reconcile. So this idea that, especially, this is another, I think, inside of hospice and palliative care, that the idea that you have time in your end of life is very important, because it gives you time to think about these things and address them. Things like your legacy, things like your relationships. And so it is very typical for people to look at their beliefs at end of life. And that doesn't mean that everybody is religious, but I think this is true for most people, that they will be grappling with these existential and spiritual questions at the end of life. And so how in healthcare we can also help them to do that, I think is something that has not been fully addressed, and is a very important part of realizing Cicely Saunders' full vision of total pain. I want to end here by looking at the article that I assigned for this week, The Literary and Cultural Heritage of Total Pain by Joe Wood. I did meet up with Joe in London when I was there researching. He's one of the few that I know of who's actually looking through the lens of the humanities. In my experience, typically people are coming from nursing and medicine when they're looking at hospice and palliative care. And so this article, I was very happy to come across this article. And so he's looking at the context in which Cicely Saunders was working. And in the beginning of the article, he makes a really important point that we have to guard against the hollow appeal to holism. And what he means by that is this typically people will say, yeah, you know, mind, body, spirit, blah, 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 right? And it just becomes a kind of a thing to say. But how is it actually enacted? How does it actually come into practice is a whole other. And it's complicated. So again, it often gets jettisoned that I just say the thing and then I move on to attending to the technical aspects of care. So he said we have to guard against that, and we have to guard against creeping routinization, which is that idea of the way our healthcare system is, comes out of this very vast bureaucracy. And so all the forms and all the administration and all of that can get, I mean, that's true for any form of bureaucracy, including teaching. And so all of this can start to get into the way of the actual practice. And so he's saying that we have to return to these touchstones to guard against that just becoming sort of words we say that don't have any real meaning. So I'm just going to touch on some of the points he's making. And so he makes another very important point, that Cicely Saunders was speaking to discussions that were happening during her time, many of them impacted by the Second World War and the Holocaust. And I think that often gets left out of the story, and is very important that had a deep and really foundational impact on her attitudes when Europe was facing, and the world was facing, this existential crisis. And so he looks at the work. So when you go into the archives in King's College, I think this is really interesting. They have Cicely Saunders library. So Joe Wood was able to work with that and to look at marginalia, which is the notes that people make in the margins, which is amazing. I think that's an incredible way to research, because you're almost getting an insight into the way the person's mind is working. And so he was going through the books that she was looking at. So she was a great reader throughout her life. So he notes the importance of the book Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. And this was required reading when I was in high school, but I don't know if it still is. If it isn't, I encourage you to read it. It's one of the most important texts of the 20th century and onward. And so, as he notes, Frankl was in a concentration camp. He was Jewish. He was a psychotherapist prior to being interned. And so in this most dire of situations, he's grappling with these existential questions of meaning. And so he makes the argument, and he goes on, he survives, and he makes the argument as a psychotherapist that for people's mental well-being, they have to answer questions of meaning. That's absolutely central. And so this is obviously related to religion. Meaning doesn't have to come from religion, but it often has done. And so this idea of meaning becomes very important to the way Saunders is understanding end-of-life care. He then looks at Martin Buber, very famous, again, Jewish philosopher, and some of you may have come across Buber in other classes. And so this idea of the I-thou relationship, that rather than the I-it relationship, that when we come into human relationship, we're dealing with something sacred, essentially. That other person partakes of the sacred. And so Wood uses the quote here, all real living is meeting. And so he believes that Cicely Saunders develops what he calls a relational approach, not just out of Buber, it's obviously out of her own experience working with patients and sitting and listening to them and talking to them. But the idea that everything in healthcare and in end-of-life care is this relational approach. And that has to always be at the center. The techniques and all of the other things are very important, but the relationship has to be at the center. And so he talks about these foundational ideas, and he looks at a number of different people, including Simone de Beauvoir, Simone Weil, other philosophers of the time, some of them religious, some of them not. And so Wood is very interested in this idea of narrative therapy, and he considers Saunders' research to be basically based on this idea of taking people's stories, recording their stories, and so on, and listening to people. And this becomes a very important part of the approach of palliative care and hospice, is just sitting and listening to somebody can be the main thing. It isn't trying to solve problems. It's not trying to have an answer to anything. It's actually just sitting and taking that person's story seriously and listening to them is one of the main practices that emerges out of this idea of total pain. And being present, just being present and bearing witness. And so, so he concludes with the findings of the Lancet Commission on the Value of Death. And I think this is just, this title says something about changes that are happening in our culture. The idea that there is value to death, I think, is so different than that idea of death denial and ignoring it until you absolutely can't anymore, which is often the way. It still happens a lot, but I think we're as a culture trying to address this. So he goes on to say, reinvigorates many of the concerns of total pain, emphasizing how death is socially determined, how it is relational and spiritual, and how it affects communities rather than just individuals. So this is very much a corrective to that discourse in Western culture about autonomy, as though anybody is completely autonomous. The idea that we're all related to other people and that we need to engage with these other dimensions of the person. So he says the commissioner's authors calling for a transformative realignment of societal norms currently based on autonomy and growth to accommodate shared vulnerability and finitude. So I really like the way he writes. This is lovely. So he's basically saying we're seeing increasingly from different sectors of our communities this call for, rather than constantly being concerned with independence, autonomy, and growth, these things make end of life very uncomfortable, if that's the only way we have of conceptualizing a life. That we also have to take on board that all human beings are vulnerable. They're vulnerable to illness, they're vulnerable to pain, and of course we're all mortal, and we all have to face end of life eventually. And so I think that in this article, Wood gives a very good kind of overview of all of these different aspects that go into the creation of this concept of total pain, and he's also warning against the way that it can become lip service. And when you look at the article on the Danish hospices, we can see the challenges that are being faced. And throughout the course, we're going to be looking at some of the challenges and what can be done to address them.